Alright, this screencast is going to continue our notes on Chapter 13. We are kind of in the middle of discussing the Missouri Crisis and Compromise that will stem from that crisis. And I did have a misspeak in 4th hour, so y'all just want to hear a little clarification real quick. So we discussed in class kind of the background of the conflict. Missouri wants to enter the United States as a slave state, which would upset the balance of free and slave states in the territory or in the nation. And the reason the balance matters is just in Congress, because if there are more slave states than free or vice versa, then the majority will get their way in terms of any sort of like sectional law that would pass at this time. So you do get some resistance pretty early on from one particular New York congressman named Talmadge, James Talmadge Jr. Let's see, I was writing his name in case we needed to know how to spell it. So whenever Missouri applies to be a slave state, he actually moved to ban further introduction of slaves into Missouri and to gradually emancipate the slaves who had already been living in the territory. And so he was trying to kind of ban, future territories from being allowed to become official slave states. Of course, that got voted down very quickly. It's just a very tense situation, both sides considering sectionalism, considering that both parts of the nation, the North and the South, are, itching to get their way. And Henry Clay will come up with a solution to this crisis known as the Missouri Compromise. Part of the compromise was that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, as it wished. Maine would be admitted to the Union as a free state. If you kind of recall a little bit about your colonial geography, Maine geographically was part of the initial 13 colonies, but it was just an extension of Massachusetts, so giving it its own statehood kind of continues the balance between free and slave states in the Union at this time. And the third aspect of the Missouri Compromise is that a line is established, a line of latitude is established at the 3630 parallel. You won't have to memorize those numbers, obviously. But this line was known as the Missouri Compromise line, and moving forward, all of the rest of the unorganized territory that at the time just included like the Louisiana Purchase at this point in history, because this is earlier than we got Texas or before we won the Mexican Cession or purchased it. So moving forward, all the line in the Louisiana Purchase, above this line, all the territory above this line, would be closed to slavery if it ever wanted to become a state. Whereas territory below that line, would be open to slavery should they vote that way. You might look at the territory and recognize that, wow, that's not really directly in the middle of the amount of territory that's being considered. It is kind of in the middle of the country, though. So you're very much drawing a line dividing the country in half. This does, solve conflict from a short-term perspective, but in the long run, you actually have a physical line dividing North and South, which is going to lead to future problems, obviously. So maybe just consider the effectiveness of that solution. Another example of just sectionalism and slavery causing conflict is something that was proposed called the Wilmot Proviso. Pennsylvania Democrat David Wilmot, which this is not, first off, not super common ideology amongst the Democrats, but you do have Northern Democrats. So he will propose that slavery be excluded from any new territory gained during the Mexican-American War. So this happened some years later. He wants an all-out ban of slavery in territory that far west. Congress will vote on the measure, but they never passed it. So this just kind of shows the growing sectionalism between the two sides and just a further division within our country's politics. we're going to transition to another kind of conflict happening within the nation involving fugitive slaves. Obviously, fugitive slaves meaning slaves that are running away, majority running from the south into the north, into free territory. Some states are kind of welcoming of this practice, like, claiming and protecting runaways in like northern states. Some northern states even have certain laws to protect runaways, but we're going to see all that kind of change in this section. The method of escape first, though, just to kind of discuss. I mean, I would argue that the majority of those that did escape did so by coming from like border states. So think about your like northernmost southern states, Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland. Like, they have the highest, best chances of actually making it into free land. So I would, say that's like what your border states are, and that's where most of them are coming from. However, you do have some coming, and running away and escaping from as far south as like New Orleans, or in Florida or Georgia. The map you see on the left depicts the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was the method of, transportation, or the method of escape for runaway slaves. It was a system of safe houses that slaves used to help escape out of slave states. So essentially, slaves in the night would move from house to house, from spot to spot, from point to point, until they made it into free territory. This would take, weeks at times. Obviously, one clarification is just that some people mistakenly think that it's like underground somehow. It's not actually underground. It just means, keep it on the DL. It's under the radar. These are essentially double agents. Like, you have people who are risking them. You have white Southerners, like living in the South, who are opening their doors to allow slaves to camp out overnight. So they're putting themselves at risk. And then you had the conductors, who are making multiple trips to the South and back, dozens of times at times, just to help family, help friends, help others escape to free territory, since they know the land and the way better than anyone. The most famous, of course, conductor of the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman, female, fugitive slave herself, who will make countless trips to help other African Americans escape slavery out of the South. And of course, the movie that just came out, Harriet, is referencing her story, so I can't wait to see that. So obviously this is not making the South very happy, the fact that there are methods of mass escape for slaves out of the South. So just to kind of showcase one of the events that's pretty detrimental long term, like towards the fugitive cause, you have a Supreme Court case known as Prague versus Pennsylvania, happened in the 1840s. This case will gain a lot of national attention and kind of open up the issue on like a national stage, to kind of get the rest of the nation looking at this issue and not it just being on like a smaller scale. So Prague was kind of like a bounty hunter, like a slave catcher. He was employed by a Maryland slaveholder to go into Pennsylvania and to reclaim a woman and her children that had escaped into Pennsylvania, like out of Maryland. The escape had actually happened like years prior to Prague's attempt at recapturing them. And during his attempted recapture in Pennsylvania, he is actually arrested and convicted of kidnapping. There are laws in Pennsylvania at this time, protecting African Americans, fugitives, as a, free state. They don't want to allow slaves to be recaptured and rebrought into slavery, so you weren't just allowed to come into a state, as like as a distant, resident of a different state, and like come in and take people back into the South. That was kidnapping. But the case does go all the way to the Supreme Court, in which they make efforts to kind of, create this like national defense of slavery and protect slavery and protect what the South wants, and the South view it as their own property. So what ends up happening is that they rule against the slaves. They rule in favor of Prague. He's released. And the Pennsylvania law that kind of allowed his arrest to begin with is thrown out, and the Supreme Court basically rules that no state law could in any way qualify, regulate, control, or restrain the actions taken by slaveholders to reclaim their quote-unquote property. So this is like a Supreme Court saying you couldn't pass state laws, that would prevent a slave owner trying to reclaim what in their eyes is theirs. We're going to have several other cases just kind of reiterate the same sentiment but secure it on a deeper and more direct level. One example of those laws that's created just to kind of strengthen that ideology that African Americans who made it to the North could in theory potentially be reclaimed is the Fugitive Slave Act. So just to kind of give a definition of the Fugitive Slave Act, and then I'll give some background on it. But the Fugitive Slave Act stated that police and citizens in free states were required to help return runaway slaves back to their owners, and if they refused, they could be punished either with a fine or jail time. So it's making it a legal requirement to aid in the return of runaway slaves, and now it's making an official federal crime to try to help or allow them to hide in the North and seek refuge when they are not a truly freed individual, but like a runaway. The reason that this law was passed, just a little bit side story, it wasn't just about the South getting their way. It was actually part of a bigger compromise. So if you kind of see the map on the bottom right, in the 1850s, 1840s really, California was becoming very populated because of the gold rush. So there's a lot of people entering California because of the gold rush, and once they get enough residents, they create a state constitution and they apply for statehood as a free state. The state of California had never legalized slavery. Note that the Missouri Compromise Line 1 doesn't really apply to California because California is part of the Mexican Cession, and the Missouri Compromise Line was created during the time where we only had gained the Louisiana territory at that point. But also, even if the line were to apply, it cuts right through California territory. You can see that on the map. So you have to justify it another way, and so the issue of balance comes back to the table because California is so populated now because of the gold rush. That will be a lot of representatives and senators, just 2 senators, but a lot of representatives that are anti-slavery. So the South, will block the admission of California pretty directly in Congress. When you need a compromise, though, who do you call? You call Henry Clay. Henry Clay at this point is known as the Great Compromiser because of all of the various compromises he provides in this unit. He basically states that California, and his compromise is known as the Compromise of 1850. So what this compromise says is that California should be allowed to enter the Union as a free state, and then moving forward, the territories of Utah and Mexico, which if you see on the map, those are just the other unclaimed, unestablished, not unclaimed, but unestablished territories that were part of the Mexican Cession. He claims that those territories should be allowed to decide whether or not they want to be slave or free based on popular sovereignty, meaning that they would just vote on it when the time came for them to make their own state constitutions, and whatever they pass would go. Also, the compromise said that the slave trade is officially banned in Washington, D.C., which is your capital city. So that shows the government moving away from slavery. So with California being free and D.C. banning slavery in trade form, that does seem like 2 strikes against the Southern vision. But the reason the South accepted this compromise is because the U.S. government agreed to pass the Fugitive Slave Act, which the Southern leaders are very happy about. Now, other people are not happy about it. You'll see many people, abolitionists, continue to help slaves escape because they feel like it's immoral And we'll kind of continue that thought on Tuesday.